This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something that feels a little bit dangerous, honestly.
This one might be messy. We're going to break some marble.
We are talking about the Renaissance. And look, we all know the script, right? We've been fed this story since grade school. The Middle Ages were dark, gloomy, plague-ridden, and, frankly, kind of stupid.
Right. And then suddenly, around the 1400s in Italy,
Florence, specifically,
the lights just flicker on. You get Da Vinci, Michelangelo, the Medicis. You get perspective in painting, the rediscovery of the ancients.
Exactly. And the narrative is that this was the big bang of modernity. Science wakes up, reason stretches its legs, the church loses its grip, and boom, the modern world is born. And logically, since Italy started it, Italy must have been the first modern nation. It was the pilot episode for the future.
It is the classic hero origin story of the West. It's elegant, it's visually stunning, and it makes perfect sense.
But I was reading through the stack of research you sent over for today,
Right.
And my head is just spinning because these sources are arguing the exact opposite.
It is a bit of a shock to the system, isn't it?
It is. The argument here is that the Renaissance didn't end the Middle Ages in Italy. In fact, the claim is it basically kept the Middle Ages alive on life support.
Exactly. Or, to use a different metaphor, it gave the Middle Ages such a beautiful, expensive, sophisticated facelift that nobody realized the underlying structure was, well, rotting.
That's a massive claim. I mean, we associate Renaissance with new. You're telling me the place that invented it, the birthplace of banking, accounting, realistic art, stayed stuck in the past because of it.
That is the core paradox we need to unravel today. The sources argue that while the Renaissance triggered revolutions and modernization in places like France, England, and Germany, in its home turf,
Italy.
in Italy it remained just
Decoration.
decoration. That feels almost insulting to Leonardo da Vinci. It sounds harsh, I know, but structurally it's pretty accurate. Our mission today is to figure out why. Why did this rebirth lead to modern governments in the North, but leave the South sort of frozen in a gilded cage?
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand this frozen state, we have to define what they were frozen in. The sources keep referencing this concept of the theological backbone of the West.
Yes.
I feel like we need to clear the decks on this before we look at the map. What is this backbone?
Definitely. If you want the shortest route to understanding the Western mind before the modern era, you can't just look at kings and wars. You have to look at the operating system.
Right.
And that operating system was really built by three intellectual giants.
The sources list Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and, surprisingly, Hegel.
Yeah. Hegel comes much, much later, 19th century, but he's important because he's the one who looked back and sort of systematized all of it.
Okay.
But let's start at the foundation. You have Augustine in the 4th century.
The Neoplatonist.
Right, so Augustine gives us this focus on the soul, the inner light. It's a vertical relationship between you and the divine. It's deeply spiritual, kind of detached from the gritty mechanics of the world. For him, the real world is the spiritual one.
Okay, so that's the spiritual core. The soul is what matters.
Then, in the 13th century, you get the heavyweight, Thomas Aquinas. And he does something really radical. He brings Aristotle back into the mix. He looks at the physical world, at logic, at nature, and he says, this stuff is good too.
And this is the scholastic system we always hear about.
Precisely. Aquinas creates this grand hierarchy. He argues that reason and nature exist, they're valid, but, and this is the crucial part, they are strictly subordinate to theology.
So reason is allowed in the building, but theology is the CEO.
That's a perfect analogy. Or think of it like an org chart. Reason is middle management. It handles the day-to-day, nature, physics, but it reports to faith. The king rules because God orders nature that way.
So the whole universe is a pyramid scheme with God at the top.
Yes. And that structure, Augustine's spirituality plus Aquinas' hierarchy, that became the backbone. It's how the state justified its power. It's how knowledge was organized.
So for a country to become modern in the sense of a secular, rational state, it has to break that backbone.
It has to snap the spine. And the argument from our sources is that France and England managed to snap it. Italy and Spain did not.
Okay, let's look at the breakers first. How did France pull it off?
France is the dramatic case. They didn't just tweak the system. They eventually, evicted the landlord. Think of Descartes. When he says, I think, therefore I am, he's grounding truth in human reason, not divine revelation.
He's cutting out the middleman.
Totally. And that seed grows into the French Enlightenment, which basically turns reason into a weapon. They use it to attack the church, to attack tradition, and then eventually the French Revolution comes along and just physically dismantles the whole theological state.
They swap God for logic.
Exactly.
Okay, so France goes for the guillotine approach. What about the British? They usually prefer things a bit quieter.
The British were much more pragmatic. They didn't declare war on theology. They just compartmentalized it. They privatized it.
A gentleman's agreement with God.
In a way, yeah. Faith became a private, personal matter. And in the meantime, they handed the keys of nature over to Isaac Newton to mathematics, and they handed politics to John Locke to contracts and experience.
It's a separation of powers, but for the mind.
Correct. So in England, theology just stopped being the meaning machine for the state. But in Italy and Spain, that separation never happened. The line from Augustine to Aquinas remained unbroken.
Theology was still the operating system.
It absolutely was.
This is where I struggle, though. We're talking about Italy, the land of Machiavelli. I mean, Machiavelli is famous for separating politics from morality. How can you say a culture that produced the prince was still stuck in a theological hierarchy?
That's the great mirage of the Italian Renaissance. We see these brilliant individual thinkers, Machiavelli, Galileo, and we assume the whole society had changed. But we have to look at who was signing the checks.
The patrons.
And who was the ultimate patron in Italy? The Pope. The papacy was the government in central Italy. And in the other city-states, the ruling families, the Medicis, the Sforzas, they derived their legitimacy from that same old hierarchical order.
So even if Machiavelli was writing these radical things, the structure he lived in was solid rock.
It was worse than solid. It was comfortable. The sources point out that in Italy, the system was working, it was wealthy, it was powerful. There was no economic incentive to overthrow the theological order because that order was making everyone rich.
So the Renaissance wasn't a rebellion against the church.
Not in Italy, no. The sources describe the Italian Renaissance as a culture boom. Think of it like a massive economic bubble, but for high culture. It wasn't a revolution. It was a luxury good.
That reframes the whole thing. It's not a political movement. It's a lifestyle brand.
That is spot on. It was a way for the rich and the church to display their status. The popes just absorbed the Renaissance. They didn't look at Raphael or Michelangelo and see a threat to their power.
They saw a really good PR campaign.
Precisely. If you're the Pope and you hire Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you aren't dismantling the church. You're making the church look so majestic, so undeniable, that no one would dare question it.
It's refinement, not revolution.
Yes. The humanists in Italy, the guys studying the ancient texts, they weren't trying to destroy the church. They were trying to clean up its Latin. They wanted the sermons to sound more like Cicero.
But hold on. What about the Greeks? I always hear about the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Byzantine scholars flee to Italy. They bring the real Plato, the real Aristotle. Doesn't that influx of raw data blow the system apart?
It's a great question. And the refugees did arrive, and they did bring the texts. But the sources make a fascinating distinction here. The Byzantines brought the content, the raw data, the grammar, the manuscripts. But they didn't bring a new attitude.
What does that mean, a new attitude?
The fire was already burning in Italy. The refugees just tossed a library on the bonfire. But again, who welcomed them? The church. The popes hired these Greek scholars as secretaries and librarians. They loved it.
So they took this potential dynamite Greek philosophy and just used it to decorate the library.
Exactly. The Greek wisdom wasn't used to question the existence of the hierarchy. It was used to garnish it, to make the arguments for God sound even smarter.
It's wild. So for a guy living in Rome in 1500, it was just the old system getting a very, very expensive facelift.
And if you think Italy was rigid, we have to talk about Spain.
Oh, Spain. The sources call this the theology as power model. This sounds ominous.
It is. Spain is the counterexample to the rest of Europe. In France, reason is starting to challenge theology. In Spain, theology is a technology of empire.
A technology, like a tool.
Think about it. Spain is building a massive global empire. They're conquering the Americas, the Philippines. How do you rule that in the 1500s? How do you unify a fractured country at home?
You use the Inquisition.
You use the Inquisition. You use the concept of a Catholic monarchy.
So they didn't need philosophy to run the state.
No. They used theology because it was an incredibly efficient tool for control. It provided the laws, the morality, the justification for conquest, everything.
So it's the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. But on an imperial scale, God says, I'm in charge, end of discussion.
Right. And this explains the tragedy of the Toledo School.
I wanted to ask about that. The Toledo School of Translators, this was in Spain, way before the Italian Renaissance. They were translating Arabic and Greek texts into Latin. By all rights, Spain should have been the leader in new ideas. They had the source code first.
You would think so. They had the access. But the sources described Toledo as a gateway, not a destination. The ideas flowed through Spain.
Like a pipeline.
Exactly. The texts were translated in Toledo, packaged up, and then shipped off to Paris, Oxford, and Bologna.
Why didn't they stay in Spain? Why didn't Spanish scholars read them and start a revolution?
Because the Spanish state didn't allow for ideological testing. You couldn't just take these new ideas and start questioning the nature of the universe or the king's authority.
I was too rigid.
It was dangerous to think too loud in Spain.
So Spain did the heavy lifting of translation, but France and England got the benefit. That is a tragic irony.
They held the keys to the library, but weren't really allowed to read the books. Or rather, they read them only to check for heresy. Just like in Italy, humanism in Spain became a tool for institutional refinement.
Better rhetoric for preachers.
Better Latin for bureaucrats. It didn't change the structure.
So we have Italy and Spain. Wealthy, sophisticated, looking great, but structurally frozen. But then how did this Renaissance thing spread to France and England and cause such chaos? Because it did cause chaos there.
This is where the story gets really interesting. We tend to think ideas spread like a virus.
Right.
But what spread wasn't some subversive philosophy. It was textbooks.
Textbooks, like school books.
Literally manuals.
Yeah.
Humanist textbooks on grammar, rhetoric, letter writing, history.
Wait, you're telling me that the contagion that modernized Europe, the thing that toppled kings and churches, was a grammar guide?
It sounds boring, but think about what those textbooks actually carried. They taught you how to write clear, persuasive Latin like the ancients. But more importantly, they taught you to look at history critically.
Critically how?
They taught you to analyze a document, to ask, is this authentic? Who wrote this? What was the context? Is the language correct for the time period it claims to be from?
So it's like teaching someone data literacy today. Once you know how to check the source code, you start spotting the bugs in the system.
Exactly. And when that skill set lands in France, it hits a very specific group of people.
Yeah.
The bureaucrats. France was trying to centralize, to build a nation state. Suddenly you have a generation of lawyers and administrators trained in this new humanist style. And they look at the old, clunky, scholastic theology of the university.
The Aquinas stuff.
Right. And they say, this is useless. This doesn't help us run a country. It's too abstract.
So it starts as an efficiency drive.
Yes. In France, it turns into a social movement. The focus on rhetoric and history becomes a weapon to criticize old corruption and build a rational state. They use grammar tools to rewrite the government.
And in England, was it the same thing?
In England, it takes a slightly different flavor. It becomes the foundation of the gentleman's education. Oxford and Cambridge start using these humanist texts not to overthrow the king, but to train useful citizens.
The practical British again.
Right. It wasn't about deep metaphysical truth. It was about, how do I give a good speech in Parliament? How do I administer a colony? How do I navigate a contract? It was useful knowledge.
So in France and England, these textbooks were the seeds of modern administration. But then there's the elephant in the room, Germany. The sources say Germany was late to the party, but when they arrived, they smashed the furniture.
Germany is the explosive case. In Italy, humanism was a polite hobby for the rich. In France, a bureaucratic reform. In Germany, it hit the universities and the theology departments head on.
Why was Germany so different?
Because Germany didn't have a massive secular court culture like Italy or a centralized state like France. Germany was this patchwork, and it was dominated by its universities and its theologians.
So the intellectuals were all religious guys.
Exactly. So when these humanist techniques, like, let's go back to the original text, arrived in Germany, they didn't apply them to poetry or tax codes.
They applied them to the Bible.
Oh, yeah. And that is a very big deal.
Huge.
This is the Ad Fontes slogan, back to the sources. In Italy, that meant reading Cicero to write a better speech. In Germany, it meant reading the New Testament in Greek and realizing the church had been maybe translating it wrong for 1,000 years.
And boom, Reformation.
Exactly. The Renaissance stage in Germany was just compressed. It didn't have time to be a cool cultural boom. It turned immediately into a theological crisis. Luther used the humanist tools, philology, translation, history, to dismantle the authority of the Pope.
So while the Italians were admiring the aesthetic beauty of the ancients, the Germans were using the ancients' tools to build a theological bomb.
That's the tragedy or the destiny of the German path. They kept the theology, but they transformed it into a battleground. They didn't secularize like the French. They just intensified the theology until it broke the church.
This brings us to a major myth-busting moment regarding science. I want to circle back to the break. There's this idea that modernity, specifically science Galileo, it all came from rediscovering the real Aristotle.
Right.
Like, once we read the Greek version instead of the Latin one, science just happened.
The sources are very clear on this.
Yeah.
That is a total myth, and it's a stubborn one.
Bust it for us. Why didn't reading the real Aristotle fix things?
Because modernity didn't come from reading the Greek Aristotle. It came from rejecting the university Aristotle.
What's the difference? Aristotle is Aristotle, isn't he?
Not to a university in the 1500s.
Yeah.
The university Aristotle was the scholastic version, the one Aquinas built. It wasn't just a book, it was a curriculum, a teaching mold. It was rigid.
So if you brought in a new, slightly different Greek version, the professors would just ignore it.
They'd say it's irrelevant to the syllabus. I mean, institutional inertia is a powerful force. We have a system, don't mess it up. The university was designed to teach confirmed truths, not to explore new ones.
I think we can all relate to that. This isn't on the test.
Exactly. Galileo didn't say, oh, look at this new Greek text, now I understand physics. He said, this entire Aristotelian system the universities are teaching is garbage. I'm going to look at the stars myself.
So the catalyst wasn't the text itself. It wasn't the content of the ancient books.
No. The real catalyst was the humanist attitude. And this is subtle. The humanists, even the devout ones, they practiced thinking without God as the premise.
Wait, explain that. Because you just said they were religious.
They were. But when they wrote a history book or a grammar book, they didn't start with because God willed it. They started with human actions, human words, human evidence.
Ah, I see. So they created a pocket of secular logic. Even if they went to church on Sunday, on Monday when they were writing history, they were using secular logic.
Exactly. They created a mental space, a secular pocket, where you could observe nature or politics directly without filtering it through theology first. And that space is where science was born.
Not inside the universities.
No. Almost all the early scientific breakthroughs happened outside the traditional university curriculum. They happened in private academies, in workshops, in correspondence networks.
This really flips the whole narrative. We usually think of progress as this straight line. The Renaissance happens, everyone gets smarter, and boom, modernity.
But the map we've drawn today shows it's not a line. It's a chemical reaction.
Yeah.
The Renaissance was the catalyst, sure, but the reaction depended entirely on what it touched.
Let's recap this because it's such a cool image. The Renaissance touches Italy and Spain.
And it finds a stable, wealthy, theological structure. The result, decoration, refinement. The Middle Ages gets a shiny new coat of paint, and the structure just hardens.
It touches France and England.
And it finds centralized monarchies and pragmatic needs. The result, institutional reform, social questioning, and eventually a political break from the past. The textbooks create a new class of thinkers who rebuild the state.
And it touches Germany.
And it finds deep theological anxiety. The result, explosion. The Reformation, the tools of the Renaissance tear the church apart.
It's amazing. Italy, the winner of the culture war, actually lost the modernization war because they were too successful at being medieval.
That's the irony. Sometimes being too good at the old game prevents you from inventing the new one. Italy had the wealth and the brilliance to maintain the old system longer than anyone else.
It really makes you think about our own time. We look at places that seem super advanced, wealthy, culturally dominant. But are they actually building the future, or are they just decorating the status quo?
That is the question, isn't it? We tend to confuse sophistication with progress. Renaissance Italy was incredibly sophisticated, the envy of the world. But structurally, it was standing still.
And the messy, chaotic, argumentative places like France and Germany.
That's where the future is being forged.
A sobering thought for the golden ages of history. Just because it glitters doesn't mean it moves.
Indeed. History doesn't reward the most beautiful. It rewards the most adaptable.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. A massive thank you for guiding us through this labyrinth of history.
My pleasure.
And thank you for listening. Next time you see a picture of the Sistine Chapel, remember, it's beautiful, but it might just be the prettiest participation trophy in the race to modernity. This has been The Deep Dive. See you next time.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.